So around the time that McGregor is theorizing on Theory X and Theory Y managers in this human relations approach, in an entirely different field, there's this biologist, Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And Bertalanffy is looking at the way in which biological organisms all seem to be governed by similar principles. And so he posits that these principles that govern the way organisms relate to one another may be found in other areas. He's specifically looking at biological systems. And he begins to hypothesize and write on this idea that because we as biological entities are governed by principles of systems, perhaps these principles are found in things that we create. Not even things that we create, but perhaps they expand beyond just the biological organism and govern the way that the organism relates to other things. So he begins to write on this idea of a general systems theory as we might find it in things like physics, economics, psychology. He's not looking yet at communication. He's not looking at organizations as we're talking about them. But there begins to be this sort of cohesion. When you look at principles of a system, things like hierarchical ordering begins to connect really well with Weber's theory of bureaucracy. Things like the interdependence of parts within a system begins to connect really well with Taylor's theory of scientific management, that the day laborer needs the manager and the manager needs the day laborer. And ideas like permeability of boundaries begins to connect really well with the human relations approach, this idea that we are people outside of the context of work, and therefore the boundary between who we are at work and who we are at home is permeable. So there's this momentum that's being built as we're starting to see this alignment between this idea of a general systems theory and the way we look at an organization. And this gets picked up as we look at the primary processes within a system. And this really is where this connection between the general systems theory, which is over here in biology and in more hard sciences, begins to resonate with where we are in the humanities looking at organizational communication. A system has two primary processes. The first is exchange, that something from outside the system enters the system and is changed into something else. And that thing that it's changed into then is expelled, it leaves the system. This makes a lot of sense when we think about how an organization functions, whether it's a business, a nonprofit, or a government, that there are ideas that come in. Those ideas are communicated through some channel that is sort of this input, this in channel to the organization, and that something then happens to that idea, that financial contribution or that resource of someone donating their time or volunteering. It is exchanged for something else, a good, a product, a service, or it's exchanged for a bill or a sense of community engagement, and that is then what is expelled or exits the organization. This is how organizations have been functioning for decades. I mean, going back to the early 1900s after the Industrial Revolution, as we begin to see this idea of this corporate entity instead of the individual laborer. You have people who come in, they give their time, and in exchange for their time, they're given money. So this really connects well. I mean, we're really only about 60-ish years removed from this. This idea of how organizations might, be implemented and function, and this idea of working for someone else in exchange for goods. So this is it's almost like a explanation, if you will, for why we see what we see. The other three approaches that we have looked at, the classical approach, the human relations approach, and the human resourcing approach, are really about how an organization might approach organizing. The systems approach is really about how those outside of an organization can understand what's happening in the organization. It's less about how a particular manager or owner or entrepreneur may approach their business, and more about how we collectively as a society might approach things like working, employment, policy making. So this is a slightly different approach, but it's really critical because it is changing the way we begin to answer questions and solve problems in an organization. If we're trying to solve them systematically versus very individually as they've been approached thus far within our culture, we're coming to different answers. We're seeing things differently. So you have Bertalanffy, who's working on this general systems theory, and we're beginning to see some good alignment with the way organizations function. In the about 10 to 15 years later, somewhere between 1975 and 1995, there is he calls himself an organizational psychologist. His name is Carl Wieck, and his contribution to this area of a systems approach is to look specifically at how do individuals within a system understand the information and the messages that are constructed within the system. So this is really one of the first ways that we begin to see this idea of feedback, which is the second process of a system, begin to apply in our discipline. Feedback is this idea of what is happening within the organization. If exchanges outwardly into the organization and outward again, feedback is all about what's happening inside the organization. And so it's less about an exchange of something and more about an internalization of the communication within. How are the different component parts of a system communicating with one another? So Carl Wieck says that there is no meaning inherent in a message that exists separate from the actors who create the message. Actors here meaning, those who are participating. And that it is their enactment of the message that gives something meaning. In other words, when I tell you about a grade that you received, I may believe that, earning a B on a particular paper is really good because the paper was tough or the ideas were really complex. So I enact meaning in the message by how I describe it, how I talk about your grade or how I talk about the paper. But the meaning doesn't exist somewhere else. It's happening as I am enacting it. But you have to then make sense of what I am telling you. You have to then make sense of how it applies to you and how it applies to other classes that you're taking and other students that you see and what you think about maybe what you might do in the future. This idea of sense making is how we build models for a particular context. Because a message enacted in the context of Taylor is going to be different than the same message enacted in a different context. while the patterns of the language might be the same, the patterns of the meaning are going to differ and vary based on the context in which the message is delivered. Things like intentional community and caring for one another and a whole person education might be used in another context separate from Taylor, but they take on a different sense, a different meaning here than they would in those places, because the way that the pattern is established throughout the meaning making and the enactment. So this idea then about an organization functioning as a system begins to gain a lot of steam, because we're seeing not only the ways that it exists apart from our communication in the organization, but we can also begin to apply them to how the communication is being enacted in an organization within this idea of a system. So around the same time that McGregor is working on his human relations principles and theories, the systems theory is also taking root. You can think of it sort of like this green cup is the human relations approach. And inside of that we have, I have the wrong cup here. Inside of that we have the systems approach. These can function separately. We can look at an organization as a system without looking at it through the human relations lens. And in fact, we can look at a system through the human resourcing lens. So while human relations and human resourcing are two very distinct theories, we can look at a systems approach, because this is happening in addition to, rather than instead of, a human resource approach or a human relations approach, which is a little bit different than how we've looked at theories thus far. When we've been looking at the different approaches to an organization, we've been looking at only using a single lens. And now with the systems approach, and we're going to talk about here in a second, the cultural approach, we can really fit these into other approaches. In fact, it fits within this idea of a machine metaphor in the classical approaches. We can look at the culture that a machine metaphor organization tends to create. We can look at the way that a machine, looking at an organization as a machine, how that functions in terms of how we might understand a system. So the approaches that we're looking at this week are a little bit different than the approaches that we've looked at before. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural approach, because this one is happening around the same time as human resourcing theories are beginning to develop. So we tend to see it used in this idea of, here's our human resourcing, and let's look at the culture that's created as a result of the programs and policies that we create. So that's how this is sort of happening. We have culture here in human resourcing, and we have systems here in human relations. But don't get too bogged down in that right now. There are two main ways that we look at how an organization may view a culture, or how we, outside of an organization, may view the culture of a given organization. The first one, and perhaps the most popular outside of research and academic writing, is the prescriptive approach. The prescriptive approach to culture says, if you have certain elements, you will have a strong or effective or desirable culture. That there are certain things that managers can do, policies that they can create, ways of engaging with their employees, ways of practicing their business, that will create a certain culture, and that culture will be strong or weak based off of the actions of the manager. So we get things like rituals. If you have rituals where you recognize individual's contribution, that is something that could lead to a strong culture. When you have heroes, people who have worked in the organization who sort of raise to a level of being a hero status, that they've saved the organization or they really represent what the organization stands for, that these help lead to a strong culture, among other things that tend to vary depending on who you're talking to. A really popular idea right now is that if you create a culture where people feel safe, that they will be happier and more productive. This is sort of taking a human relations and a cultural approach and trying to marry the two of them together in a way that's supposed to lead to some sort of desirable outcome. You can imagine why this is really popular with individuals who work in an organization or who are managers. If they feel that they have the ability to contribute to a high-performing culture, then they're going to feel more empowered and in control of what happens in the organization. This sort of brings up a really interesting question. Let's say that this is true, that a person could create a desired culture. Well, then that means the manager has a lot of responsibility to create that culture, right? And if the culture doesn't measure up, you either retrain your manager to create a culture you want, or you find a different manager. It's very easy to solve that problem if you believe culture is prescriptive. Let's look at the reverse of that though for a second. Let's say that culture is not about the choices made by a manager, that we can't create the culture that we want, but the manager believes they can. They take actions to create a culture that they believe will be healthy, be productive. Their actions may inadvertently create a culture that is contrary to the culture they think they're creating. This sort of gestures towards this second perspective on culture, that this descriptive perspective, that culture is emergent. It emerges from the choices, behaviors, and communication of those within the organization, including managers, but also including those without formal power. You may see this as everyone here at Taylor, from groundskeeping crew to the people who make your food in the DC, to your professors, to the housekeeping staff, to the administration, to you, the students, as contributing to the culture of this place. That would be how a descriptive approach to culture would choose to look at Taylor. A prescriptive approach would say, if there's a cultural problem here at Taylor, then it's the responsibility of the administration, and particularly it would be the president, it would be the board of trustees, and it would be probably the provost and the academic deans to change the culture. Or it would be on the, this is interesting, it would be on the student body president and his cabinet, or his staff, or her cabinet and staff. It's male. We have a male student body president right now. Should probably go back and check that. If you're watching, go ahead and just throw in Slack the name of our student body president, and whether they are male and female, and maybe do some research and find out how many female student body presidents we've had. That would be really interesting. Or if there's an explanation for why it's male student body president and female vice student body president. Is that the title? Throw that in Slack if you're watching. We can confuse some people who aren't watching the videos. Don't give any context for why you're throwing it in there. Okay, what was I talking about? Back to this culture approach, right? If I take the prescriptive approach, then I believe that the manager has a disproportionate amount of power in deciding the culture. But if I take a descriptive approach, then what it means is everyone within the organization is able to contribute to the culture, because it means that culture is far more complicated than a collection of values that will determine a good or bad outcome. It means that culture is going to vary over time as people come in and out of the organization. Culture is, I think, more meaningful a concept if we look at it as descriptive than if we look at it as prescriptive. At least internally. If culture is prescriptive, then culture is more valuable to an organization in terms of finances. If it's descriptive, culture is more valuable to an organization because it means that more people have a hand in creating it than in the prescriptive approach. Okay, let's fly back out to the 5,000 foot view for just a second. I don't want you to get bogged down in how we look at a system or how we look at a culture as if the people within the organization are the ones deciding how it gets looked at, which is different than the classical approaches and the human approaches that we've looked at. This is a little bit different. This is, instead, you could pair some of these lenses together. You could pair a systems approach with a human relations approach, or you could pair it with a human resourcing approach, or you could pair it with a classical approach. And the same could be done with the cultural approaches. The approaches that we're talking about this week are more about how you, an outsider, could try and answer some questions or solve some problems that are happening within an organization. And if you take a systems approach, you're going to be looking at things like the boundaries within an organization. You're going to be looking at things like the identity of the organization, the interdependence, and the way that communication flows in a system or a communication network. If you take a cultural approach, you're going to be looking at things like what are the values and the assumptions, the practices, and the heroes or the people who get talked about, the stories and narratives, and how is that used to shape an environment in which things happen and communication takes place. This is different than necessarily the approaches we've looked at in the past. And as the approaches that we've looked at in the past, some of them are sort of been cannibalized, and we don't really use all of those approaches anymore in most organizations, most industries. That hasn't happened with a systems or a cultural approach because it's not, there's sort of different ideas here. The first three approaches that we've looked at have really been how an organization may approach organizing. These next two, cultural and systems, are really more about how we from the outside may look at how an organization is organizing and how a communication